She celebrates the moment his box hits the elevator floor. "Somebody hand me a glass," she says. "We are finally free of him." 12 floors below her office, a man she has just destroyed carries 3 years of quiet sacrifice out of a building he will never enter again. Nobody in that room knows what he actually is. In 11 minutes, they will all find out, and not one of them will ever forget it. Marcus Deshawn Coleman is 38 years old. He works as a senior logistics specialist on the 9th floor of Ashford Meridian Group, a mid-sized freight and distribution firm headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. He stands 6'1", with a runner's build that comes from years of walking his kids to school instead of driving, and on the inside of his left forearm there is a raised, pale scar shaped almost like a comma, a permanent reminder of the accident that changed his life 3 years ago. Most days he wears the same 3 collared shirts in rotation, pressed but never new, because a man raising 2 children on $41,000 a year does not spend money on things that are not strictly necessary. He keeps a small photograph of his late wife tucked inside his wallet rather than on his desk, not because he wants to hide it, but because he has never wanted to explain it to strangers who ask questions out of curiosity rather than care. And there is a difference between the two that Marcus learned to recognize a long time ago. He is the father of 2. Amara Coleman is 9, sharp-eyed and stubborn, the kind of child who corrects adults when they get facts wrong and does not apologize for it. Xavier Coleman is 6, quieter than his sister, prone to nightmares that Marcus still gets up for at 2 in the morning without complaint. Their mother, Denise Coleman, died 3 years ago from a brain aneurysm that gave no warning at all. She collapsed in the kitchen while making dinner on a Tuesday in April, and by the time Marcus got home from work, she was already gone. There was no long illness to prepare for, no conversation about what would happen next. One day there were 2 parents in that house, and the next day there was 1, and Marcus had 31 days of bereavement leave before Ashford Meridian expected him back at his desk. The mornings after Denise died were the hardest architecture Marcus ever had to build from nothing. He learned to braid Amara's hair from a video he watched at 11 at night, pausing it every 10 seconds, his fingers too large and too slow at first, until 3 weeks in his hands finally remembered the motion without thinking about it. He learned which brand of oatmeal Xavier would actually eat and which one triggered a fight every single morning. He learned to recognize the particular cry that meant a nightmare rather than simple wakefulness, and to sit on the edge of Xavier's bed without turning the light on, because the light made it worse. None of this appeared anywhere on a performance review. None of it explained itself to a department that measured people by the hours they logged between 9 and 5. It simply existed, underneath everything else, the way the best and hardest parts of a person's life usually do. He never remarried. He never really dated. His life since that April has run on a single fixed arithmetic. Get the kids to school, get to work, get through the work, get home before 6, help with homework, cook something that is not from a box at least 4 nights a week, put them to bed, and then sit alone at the kitchen table with whatever was left of the day's problems. He rents a small 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood called Ridgemont Park, and every month after the mortgage-style rent, the after-school program, and Xavier's asthma medication, there is rarely more than $300 left over. He has been saving toward a down payment on a home of his own for 2 years, and the account currently holds $4,112. Marcus has never once applied for a promotion at Ashford Meridian, even though the company has opened its account management track twice in the past 3 years. Human Resources filed him mentally under low ambition. The truth was simpler than that, and nobody ever asked him what it was. A promotion meant regional travel, sometimes 4 days a week, and there was no version of his household that could absorb a father disappearing for 4 days at a time. So he stayed in his seat by the window, the only desk on the floor without a single photograph or novelty mug, just a monitor, a keyboard, and 2 legal pads stacked square at the corner. And he did the hardest, least glamorous work in the building because nobody else wanted it, and somebody had to. When a distribution account in Toledo went dark for 6 weeks, Marcus rebuilt the relationship over 14 phone calls and a completely rewritten payment schedule, working through his lunch breaks because there was no other time to do it. When a compliance filing for the southeastern region came back rejected 36 hours before a hard deadline, he found the transcription error at 1 in the morning, sitting at his kitchen table after the kids were asleep, and had a corrected package couriered by 7. The floor knew these things happened. The floor did not connect them to him, because the woman who ran his department never once stood up in a meeting and said his name. Abusnaler permanent forwidarmdi, forbi dananig, fordarnda, lia befoundig, pordi, musnarnisnond. She has run the department for 2.5 years, and she has a habit of pulling client correspondence logs every Friday afternoon, the way other people check stock prices. She wears her ambition the way she wears her blazers, tailored, expensive, and impossible to miss. The commercial division director, a man named Harold Bryce, announced his retirement in the fall, effective in 6 weeks. Vanessa has already met with 2 board members informally. Her presentation deck already runs 11 slides, and she already knows, with a precision that unsettles her at night, exactly what stands between her and that office. Vanessa came up through the company differently than Marcus did. She started in marketing analytics straight out of business school, moved into strategic accounts after 2 years, and made department head at 31, the youngest director in company history at the time. She is genuinely good at the parts of the job that are visible: the client dinners, the polished decks, the confident delivery in front of a room of executives who respond to certainty even when the certainty is not entirely earned. She has told herself, more than once, that this is simply what leadership looks like, translating the granular, invisible work happening beneath her into a story a boardroom can actually absorb. She does not think of it as theft, she thinks of it as packaging. It is only very late at night, on the drives home she does not remember taking, that a smaller, quieter voice asks her whether packaging and theft are always as different as she needs them to be. It is not a competitor. Marcus Coleman has never applied for anything in his life at that company. It is worse than that. It is the correspondence log itself. Every quarter, when Vanessa pulls the department's records to build her performance summary for the executive floor, the same name keeps surfacing underneath the biggest wins, never in the headline slide, never in the presentation she delivers upstairs, but underneath it, in the raw data. The Toledo recovery, the compliance fix, the renegotiated terms with a distributor in Savannah. If anyone above her ever opened the source files instead of reading her polished summary, they would discover that a department she claims to lead runs almost entirely through one desk by the window, and that the woman taking credit for it has spent 2.5 years quietly erasing the name attached to the actual work. She told herself for a long time that this was simply how management functioned. Managers present team results, that is the job description. But over the last year the story had become harder to hold, because the results were not distributed across a team. They were concentrated in one man, and the concentration was becoming impossible not to notice, at least to anyone who bothered to look closely, which nobody had, until a company called Halbrook Industries entered the picture. It started small, and it started with Marcus, which Vanessa knows because she personally approved the initial travel expense report and thought nothing of it at the time. A cold introduction at a logistics conference in Nashville back in March, a follow-up call, then another. The man on the other end, Derek Halbrook Jr., handles North American partnerships for his family's company and is known across the freight industry as nearly impossible to close. A man who has walked away from 3 suppliers in 2 years over what he calls handshake failures, meaning promises made in a boardroom and quietly broken 6 months later. He does not respond to sales pitches. He responds, it turns out, to a man who answers his emails at 11 at night and never once oversells anything he cannot deliver. By July, the conversation had become a real negotiation. By September, there was a full agreement on the table, worth $9,400,000 over 3 years, the largest single contract in Ashford Meridian's 41-year history, and Vanessa had done exactly what she always did. She built the summary. She presented the progress upstairs at the monthly executive review. She used the word "we" so many times that the word stopped meaning anything at all, and nobody upstairs ever asked to see the correspondence thread underneath it, because why would they? What she told herself, lying awake some nights, was that the deal was essentially finished, the terms were settled, the relationship was built. Whatever remained was paperwork, and paperwork did not require the man by the window. It required a director's signature, and in 6 weeks there would be a new director, and everything after that would belong to whoever was holding the pen. There is one document Vanessa never actually read. Derek Halbrook had insisted on a personnel continuity clause, buried in the final annex, negotiated directly with Marcus across 4 separate late-night calls in the last week of revisions. Vanessa received that annex as a 41-page email attachment on a Thursday afternoon, and did not open it, because she had a dinner reservation that night, and the file looked administrative. She filed it away with every intention of reading it later. Later never came. There were other moments before this one. Moments nobody on the 9th floor ever heard about, because Marcus was not a man who talked about himself. 2 years earlier, he had gone to a branch of First Piedmont Bank to apply for a home equity line, hoping to finally move his children out of a rental and into something that belonged to them. He sat across from a loan officer named Trent Ferris, a young man barely 30, who scrolled through Marcus's application without once making eye contact, and told him, flatly, that his debt-to-income ratio was concerning for a single applicant with dependents, even though the number on the page was well within the bank's own published guidelines. Marcus asked to see the guideline in writing. Ferris told him the guidelines were internal. Marcus left with nothing, and it was 6 months before he tried another bank, because the drive home that day had cost him more than the rejection itself. There was the afternoon at Xavier's kindergarten graduation, a small, unremarkable ceremony in a school gymnasium with folding chairs and a sheet cake, when the assistant principal, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who did not know Marcus's name despite 2 years of drop-offs and pickups, asked him, in front of 3 other parents, whether he was there picking up on behalf of someone else, because she had assumed, without asking, that a man standing alone at a kindergarten graduation must be a driver or a family friend rather than a father. Marcus said he was Xavier's dad. She said, "Oh," and nothing else, and moved on to the next family, and Xavier, 6 years old and holding a paper diploma, had heard the entire exchange and asked his father in the car why the lady thought he wasn't really his dad. Marcus told him some people just don't ask before they decide things, and left it there, because there was no better answer available. There was the Saturday at a Home Depot on Independence Boulevard, 11 months before the Halebrook contract, when a loss prevention associate followed Marcus through the lumber aisle for 9 full minutes while he compared prices on 2x4s for a bookshelf he was building for Amara's room, and stopped him at the exit to ask for a receipt for the $63 of materials in his cart, a request the same associate did not make of the 2 customers ahead of him in line. Marcus produced the receipt without argument, because arguing in that moment carried a cost he could not afford to pay with 2 children waiting for him at home, and he never told anyone at work about it, because it was one incident among many, and he had learned by then that there was no version of retelling it that did not also require him to relive it. There was also, 3 weeks before the Halebrook call reached its final language, a night when Amara padded downstairs at 11 o'clock for a glass of water and found her father on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in the calm, patient voice he used for work calls, saying numbers she did not understand and a company name she had never heard before. She did not interrupt him. She got her water, and on her way back upstairs she heard him say, quietly, that he did not care whose name ended up on the final paperwork, only that the deal was fair to everyone involved. She did not think much of it at the time. She would think about it a great deal later, once she understood exactly what those words had actually cost him. None of these moments appeared anywhere in his personnel file. None of them were the reason the resignation letter existed. But they were the accumulated weather Marcus carried into that conference room on October 15th, the quiet, private ledger of a man who had spent years being underestimated in rooms both large and small. A ledger that made the silence in that corridor after his resignation feel less like a single betrayal and more like the latest entry in a pattern he had almost stopped expecting anyone to interrupt. On the night of October 14th, Marcus sits at his kitchen table with a laptop and a mug of coffee that has long since gone cold, because Halbrook's executive committee operates 11 time zones ahead, and the final language on liability transfer has to be settled before their board convenes at dawn. The call starts at 10 at night. It is still going at 4 in the morning. Derek Halbrook stays on the line the entire time, apologizing twice for the hour. Marcus tells him not to worry about it. They work through the indemnity schedule clause by clause, and at one point Halbrook pushes back hard on a limitation that Ashford Meridian's own legal team had inserted, and Marcus does something no salesman is supposed to do. He agrees with him. He says the clause protects the company and not the partnership, and he proposes alternative language that gives Halbrook more room to operate. There is a long silence on the other end before Halbrook speaks again. He says that in 19 years of running partnerships, he has never had a supplier argue against his own legal department at 4 in the morning, and that this is the exact reason he is willing to sign at all. Marcus says something modest and moves on to the next line item. He does not write the moment down. It does not occur to him that it matters. The call ends at 10 minutes to 5. He sleeps for 2 hours and wakes to a phone that never charged because he unplugged it the night before to power the laptop instead. He badges into the 9th floor at 9:40 in the morning, 40 minutes past the start of core hours, the first time all year he has been late for anything at all. Vanessa has been at her desk since 8 o'clock. She watches him step off the elevator, and what moves through her is not calculation exactly, but relief, the specific relief of a person who has already decided something and has just been handed a cleaner excuse for it. At 8:41 that morning, before he had even walked through the door, she opened a departmental template on her computer and generated a document she intended to use before the end of the week. His lateness simply made the timing convenient. That is all it did. She calls a meeting for 10 o'clock in the corner conference room and asks a colleague named Gregory Doyle to sit in as a witness. She does not tell him why. Marcus comes in holding the Halbrook file under his arm. He sets it on the table and does not open it yet. Vanessa begins by asking what time he arrived, and he tells her, and she writes it down. She asks whether he is aware of the department's core hours policy. He says he is. She asks whether he filed any notice of a schedule variance, and he says he did not, because he was on a call with Halbrook's executive committee until nearly 5 that morning. Vanessa does not ask about the call. That is a choice, and she makes it in less than a second. She looks down at her notes instead and says the department cannot evaluate personal explanations for policy failures, because if it did, everyone would have one. She says this reflects a pattern of unreliability. She uses the phrase repeated availability issues, a phrase that describes nothing that has ever actually happened. Gregory Doyle, at the end of the table, writes it down as though it were an established fact. Marcus places his hand flat on the folder. He says there is a $9,400,000 agreement inside it that reached final language 6 hours earlier, and that if she wants to discuss the last 24 hours, that is what the last 24 hours actually were. Vanessa tells him the deal is a departmental achievement and that no individual on the team gets to use a client relationship as a shield for personal conduct. She says it evenly, without raising her voice, and it lands harder than shouting would have. Then she opens a folder of her own, takes out a single sheet of paper, and slides it across the table. It is a voluntary resignation letter, already dated, already formatted with his full name, his title, and his employee number filled into the appropriate fields. The only blank space on the entire page is the signature line. She tells him the company is prepared to treat this as a mutual decision, which would protect his employment record, and that the alternative is a formal disciplinary process that would follow him permanently. She calls it a professional courtesy and says she is extending it because she respects what he has contributed. Marcus looks at the date on the letter and understands, in that instant, that the page existed before this meeting, probably before the morning, possibly before he had ever walked through the door late at all. He tells her there is a personnel continuity clause in Annex 4 of the Halbrook Agreement, negotiated in the final round, and that she needs to read it before either of them signs anything. He says it in the same flat, even register he uses for everything, which turns out to be the problem, because it does not sound like a warning. Vanessa tells him she has reviewed the Hellbrook documentation thoroughly and is not going to let a policy conversation get redirected into a contract briefing. She says implementation is administrative and the department will manage it. Then she asks him to make a decision. He turns his head slightly, without fully looking at Gregory Doyle, and asks whether he thinks this is reasonable. Doyle shifts in his chair. He says everyone has to be held to the same standard, that if one specialist can roll in whenever he wants, it undermines the entire floor. He uses the word discipline. It is not exactly a lie. It is a man choosing which side of the table to sit on, and choosing quickly. Marcus hears the choice clearly. Vanessa says she will give him a few minutes and leaves the room, deliberately leaving the door open, because within 90 seconds, the substance of what happened crosses the floor the way these things always do. When Marcus steps out for water, two people near the printer stop talking mid-sentence. Someone by the kitchen says, loud enough to carry, that it is about time somebody addressed it. Another voice agrees that the department cannot keep running on special cases. Marcus stands in the corridor with a paper cup in his hand and does the only arithmetic that has ever actually mattered to him. 3 years alone, raising 2 children, 14 phone calls to save an account in Toledo, a compliance package couriered at 7 in the morning after a night with almost no sleep, 7 months building a relationship with a man on the other side of the world who had walked away from 3 suppliers before him, 6 hours on a call the previous night, arguing against his own legal department because it was the honest thing to do. And in the 4 minutes since that conference room door opened, not one person on this floor has asked him a single question. Not what happened, not why he was late, not what was inside the folder sitting on that table. 30 people who have watched him work for 3 straight years reached their verdict in under 4 minutes, and the verdict is that he is a problem being handled. That is the thing that finally moves inside him. Not anger. Marcus has never had much talent for anger. Something quieter and more permanent moves instead. He has spent 3 years believing that if you simply do the work properly, the record will eventually speak for you. Standing in that corridor, with a cooling cup of water, he understands, all at once, that there is no record. There is only the story people tell about you, and he has never told his own, and someone else has been telling it for 2.5 years. He walks back into the conference room. Vanessa returns with her tablet under her arm and asks whether he has reached a decision. Marcus picks up the pen. He does not argue. He does not request the human resources representative he is legally entitled to. He does not raise the annex a second time. He signs his name on the line, straightens the page, and slides it back across the table. Then he says the only thing from that room Vanessa Whitmore will remember for the rest of her career. He tells her she has never once, in 2.5 years, asked him what he was actually working on, and that one day she is going to wish she had. She takes it as a threat, files it away as bitterness, and notes the time on her tablet. He goes back to his desk and takes an empty copier paper box from beside the cabinet. Packing takes 11 minutes, because there is almost nothing to pack. 2 legal pads, a spare phone charger, a department mug he never once actually used. He leaves the laptop, the badge, and the Hellbrook folder squared neatly at the center of the desk, because the folder belongs to the company, and he is not a man who takes things that are not his. Nobody stands up. Somebody near the elevator bank says, "Take care," in a voice pitched for the room rather than for him. Vanessa waits until the doors close. Then she steps into the open center of the floor, puts both hands on the back of an empty chair, and announces that, after a long and difficult process, the department is finally moving forward, and that she is buying drinks at a bar called Marlowe's at 7 o'clock tonight to celebrate clearing the last obstacle standing in the way of where this team is going. She celebrates the moment his box hits the elevator floor. The applause starts with Gregory Doyle. It spreads the way applause always does, out of relief and social reflex, and the ordinary human wish to be standing with the winner. Someone laughs. Someone else asks whether the tab is open. The elevator indicator ticks steadily down toward the lobby, and nobody on the 9th floor watches it go. 16 floors above them, Evelyn Harcourt has been reading the same document since 9 o'clock that morning. She has run Ashford Meridian as chairwoman for 6 years, and what she trusts is paper, not because she is suspicious of her managers, but because she learned early in her career that summaries are written by people with a personal interest in how they read. She applies this principle rigorously to every contract, and as she will later admit in front of 30 people, not nearly rigorously enough to her own organization's internal culture. The Halbrook Agreement arrived fully executed at 9 that morning, carrying signatures from Halbrook's entire board, dated 6 a.m., $9,400,000 over 3 years. Evelyn cleared her calendar and started reading at page 1, and she is still going 2 hours later when she reaches the 4th Annex, Section 14, Subsection C. The agreement's execution is contingent upon Marcus Coleman's continuous direct engagement as program lead, and in the event of his departure from Ashford Meridian for any reason, Halbrook Industries reserves the unilateral right to terminate the entire agreement without penalty. His name appears 11 times across 4 pages. There is no substitution mechanism written anywhere in the document, and no cure period. Evelyn reads it twice. Then she calls down to the 9th floor to arrange an introduction, because in 6 years running this company, she has never once been in a room with the man responsible for the largest contract Ashford Meridian has ever signed. A departmental assistant tells her that Mr. Coleman resigned that morning and has already cleared his desk. She does not ask a second question. She takes the stairwell down from the 12th floor because it is faster than waiting for an elevator, and she carries the annex with her the entire way. The stairwell door opens onto the 9th floor in the middle of a conversation about whether Marlowe's takes reservations for parties over 20 people. The room does not fully understand her arrival at first. Vanessa comes out of her glass office with her tablet already in hand, already assembling a greeting, because a visit from the chairwoman on a day like this can only mean one thing to her. Evelyn says the Halbrook board executed the agreement at 6 o'clock that morning. $9,400,000 over 3 years, the largest single contract Ashford Meridian has ever signed. She says it flatly, the way people deliver news they have not had time to actually feel yet. For about 2 seconds, the floor reacts the way any floor reacts to good news. Someone claps once, before realizing nobody else has joined in. Then Evelyn stops smiling on their behalf. She raises the annex. Nobody moves. She says the agreement carries a personnel continuity clause. She reads Section 14, Subsection C aloud, all of it, and she does not soften the sentence about unilateral termination. The air conditioner is the only sound in the room for 3 full seconds. She says Halbrook's confidence in this entire arrangement rests on one named individual, that the individual is named 11 times in the document. Then she says the name, Marcus Coleman. Nobody breathes. She lowers the pages and asks, for the 2nd time that day, where he is. The silence that follows has a specific quality to it. It is not shock exactly. It is 30 people simultaneously reviewing the last hour of their own behavior. Vanessa recovers first, because she has to. She says Marcus resigned voluntarily that morning, that it was entirely his own decision, and that the department accepted it with regret. She hears how thin the word regret sounds coming out of her own mouth. Evelyn asks what time. Vanessa says around 10. Evelyn looks at the annex and says that Halbrook's board signed at 6, which means that for 4.5 hours, Ashford Meridian was actively party to an agreement conditioned on a man it was, at that very moment, in the process of removing, and that the condition was broken by this company, in this building, by somebody standing on this floor right now. Gregory Doyle is staring at the carpet near the kitchen. The person who announced it was about time somebody addressed it has gone entirely still. Evelyn asks who handled the resignation. Vanessa says she did, as his department head, and that there had been an attendance issue. Evelyn then asks the question that will define everything that follows. She asks whether anyone in that meeting knew, at the time, that Marcus Coleman had been on a negotiation call with Halbrook's executive committee until nearly 5 o'clock that morning. Vanessa says no. It is the first outright lie, and she tells it standing directly next to Gregory Doyle, the man who sat at the end of that conference table and wrote down the phrase, repeated availability issues, while Marcus said the words $9 million out loud in front of him. Evelyn tells Vanessa to have Marcus on the phone before the end of the day and walks back toward the stairwell, the floor where nobody is talking about Marlowe's anymore. The first call goes to voicemail at 12:40, so does the second. By 4 o'clock, Vanessa has called 9 times, sent 4 text messages, and emailed twice from her personal address after his company account bounced her back. Marcus is sitting in his car in a grocery store parking lot when the calls start. He watches her name appear on the screen and does not touch the phone. He is not being dramatic about it. He simply has nothing left to say to her, and he has spent 3 years being the person who always picks up on the first ring. At 4:20, Evelyn stops delegating and calls Derek Holbrook herself, and she tells him the truth, because there is no version of the next 24 hours in which lying to Derek Holbrook improves anything at all. She tells him Marcus Coleman was separated from the company that morning, that she was not informed until after the fact, that it appears he was pressured into signing a prepared resignation letter, and that she intends to correct it. Holbrook listens without interrupting. Then he explains why the clause exists in the first place. He says Holbrook Industries has walked away from 3 suppliers in 2 years, and the reason has been identical every single time. The person who actually built the relationship gets pushed out within a year of signature, replaced by someone who never made a single one of the promises now being enforced. He says his board authorized $9,400,000 on exactly one condition, and the condition was never a company, it was a person. He gives Evelyn until end of business the following day, 26 hours. That is the number legal writes on the whiteboard in Evelyn's office at 4:15 that afternoon. 26 hours until the termination notice transmits automatically from Holbrook's own legal system, and beneath it someone writes a second figure, $9,400,000, and beneath that a third, the value of 2 additional supplier commitments already locked against a contract that could disappear before the following evening. If Marcus Coleman is not confirmed back in place by then, Holbrook will exercise the termination right, and he adds, without any pleasure in his voice, that his board would be extremely reluctant to ever reopen discussions with a firm capable of doing this to the man who built the deal in the first place. Evelyn's hand is not entirely steady when she sets the phone down. General Counsel notices it and says nothing. 26 hours is not very much time to undo 2.5 years. Evelyn asks him for exactly one thing, that she be allowed to explain the situation to Marcus herself before Holbrook makes any direct contact with him. Holbrook agrees, and something in the way he agrees suggests he had already been considering making that call. By 5 o'clock, the crisis has climbed the entire building. Legal is in Evelyn's office with the resignation letter, reporting that the document was generated from a departmental template at 8:41 that morning, 59 minutes before Marcus badged in at 9:40. Finance is modeling the financial exposure and pushing it well past $9 million because 2 supplier commitments had already been locked in against the contract's first-year volume. Human Resources reports that Marcus never requested a representative, that none was ever offered, and that no prior written warning of any kind exists anywhere in his personnel file. His last 3 performance reviews all sit in the top decile of the entire department. All 3 carry Vanessa Whitmore's signature at the bottom. Vanessa sits alone in her glass office watching executive floor traffic move through the internal messaging system, understanding by degrees that what she constructed is not going to hold. She built her entire position on being the person who delivered Holbrook. She spent the morning removing the only person Holbrook ever agreed to actually work with. There is no arrangement of words that lets those 2 facts sit comfortably together, and she has until end of business tomorrow to find one anyway. At 7 o'clock she goes to Marlowe's alone, because 11 people quietly canceled, and she cannot face the 9th floor. She sits at the bar for 40 minutes and does not order a second drink. Evelyn finds Marcus the next morning by driving to his house herself at 20 minutes to 8, because he has answered nothing, and she has run out of intermediaries. She stands on his front step in a coat she has not bothered to button, and tells him she is not there as his former employer, but as the person who failed to notice what was happening inside her own building. He lets her in. They sit at the kitchen table where the laptop had been 27 hours earlier, and the coffee she is offered is the first thing anyone from Ashford Meridian has given him in a very long time. Evelyn tells him about the annex, about Halbrook's deadline, about exposure running well past $9 million. Then she offers him the directorship of the entire program, a substantial increase in compensation, and a written apology in whatever form he wants it delivered. Marcus listens to all of it without interrupting, the same way he listened to Halbrook on the indemnity schedule 2 nights earlier. Then he tells her she has the situation backward. He says the reason he signed that letter was never that he was being fired. He signed it because he stood in that corridor for 4 minutes, and 30 people who had watched him work for 3 straight years did not ask him a single question. Not what happened, not why he was late, not what was in the folder sitting on that table. He says the money was never the thing he wanted. What he had wanted for 3 years was for the work to be visible while it was actually happening. It never had been, and $9,400,000 had not changed that. It had only made the mistake expensive. Evelyn says the company will restructure whatever he asks it to restructure. Marcus says companies restructure when a contract is at risk, and then they quietly go back to exactly how they were before, and he has watched that shape happen enough times in his career to recognize it instantly. He tells her he is grateful she came, and he means it, and then he tells her no. She asks him to think about it. He tells her he has thought about very little else since 4:51 the previous morning, and that thinking is not the problem here. Evelyn leaves at 8:20 without an answer. At 11 that morning, Derek Halbrook calls Ashford Meridian and asks for the chairwoman directly. His board convened early and authorized a formal notice of termination under Section 14, subsection C, to be transmitted at close of business unless the continuity condition is satisfied. The letter is already drafted. He reads her the opening paragraph so there is no ambiguity whatsoever about what is coming. Then he tells her one more thing, and he says it without any pleasure at all. If Ashford Meridian cannot keep Marcus Coleman, Halbrook Industries intends to approach him directly and offer him a position running the exact same program from the other side of the table. He says the man spent 7 months building something on the strength of his own name, and Halbrook Industries would rather employ that name outright than spend a year litigating over it. Evelyn hangs up and sits with it. The exposure is no longer $9,400,000 and a damaged reputation. It is the very real possibility that the man this company threw out on a Tuesday morning will be running the identical program from the opposing side of the table before the end of the quarter. Downstairs, Vanessa is summoned to the executive floor at 20 minutes to 12, and she comes up carrying a folder of her own and a version of events she has rehearsed twice in the elevator on the way up. She says Marcus had been exhibiting an attendance pattern for months, that the resignation was mutual, and that she acted purely to protect departmental standards. Evelyn lets her finish completely. Then she turns her monitor around and shows Vanessa a single line of document metadata. Created 8:41 a.m. badge, record 9:40 a.m. She asks Vanessa one direct question, whether she knew about the Halbrook call at the time she placed that letter on the table. Vanessa does not answer it, and the silence answers for her. Evelyn suspends her on the spot, effective immediately, pending a formal internal review, and tells her to surrender her building credentials before leaving the floor. Vanessa says something about wanting to state her position in writing. Evelyn tells her she will have that opportunity, and that everything she has already said is now part of the record. Vanessa rides down alone and does, for the first time, the arithmetic she has been avoiding for 2.5 years. She wanted a title. To get it, she removed the one person the largest agreement in company history depended on entirely. That removal is going to cost the firm more than $9 million and possibly the client permanently. And every document that proves exactly what she did sits inside a system she does not control and never had the ability to edit. The internal review opens at 1 o'clock that afternoon. Evelyn runs it herself alongside General Counsel and the head of Human Resources because the deadline is end of business and there is no time to convene a full committee. She gives them one instruction only, that they are not looking for a conclusion. They are looking for the sequence. The correspondence log comes first. It runs to over 1,000 items across 7 months, and the shape of it becomes visible within 10 minutes. The introduction at the Nashville conference in March. The follow-up call. 53 separate exchanges with Derek Halbrook between April and July, every single one originating from Marcus's account. Most of them sent well outside standard business hours because of the time difference. Not one message in the entire thread carries Vanessa Whitmore's name in the sender field. Then the calendar. 4 sessions with Halbrook's executive committee across September and October, all created by Marcus, all sent to the department distribution list, all declined by Vanessa without ever being opened. The last of them, titled Halbrook Final Terms, Overnight Session, was declined on a Friday afternoon while Vanessa was sitting in the same system reviewing correspondence logs for her own performance summary. The recorded portion of the September executive review is harder to sit through. Human Resources pulls the file and plays 4 minutes of it aloud. On the recording, Vanessa describes the Halbrook negotiation to the executive committee using the phrase, "Our team has developed," and then the phrase, "under my direct oversight." A board member asks who the actual point of contact is. Vanessa says the department maintains the relationship. She never once says Marcus's name in an executive meeting, not a single time, in 7 months. General Counsel checks the 3 prior quarterly reviews and confirms the same pattern in every one of them. That is the point at which the pattern stops resembling carelessness. Legal pulls the Toledo account file, the compliance filing, and the renegotiated Savannah terms, and in every single one, the same architecture appears. His work sits in the substrate. Her summary sits on top. His name is in the correspondence. Hers is in the presentation. 2.5 years of it, consistent enough to constitute a method rather than an accident. There is one more piece of evidence nobody had thought to look for until an IT administrator, pulled in to help retrieve the metadata on the resignation letter, mentions almost in passing that the building's badge system logs more than entry times. It also logs which conference rooms are reserved, and by whom, and how far in advance. A quick search turns up a reservation for the corner conference room, made under Vanessa's login, at 7:51 that morning, nearly 2 hours before the meeting she claimed was called in direct response to Marcus's lateness. The reservation is titled, simply, Coleman Final. Evelyn stares at the screen for a long moment before asking the administrator to print it and add it to the file. It is the kind of detail that does not change the outcome of the review. It simply removes any remaining question of intent. The resignation letter closes the question completely. Created at 8:41 on the morning of October 15th, from a departmental template, pre-populated with Marcus's employee number and job title. He badged in at 9:40. The letter existed 59 minutes before the man it named ever walked through the door, which means the lateness never actually produced the decision. It was an occasion that had already been located and was simply waiting to be used. General Counsel puts it in the plainest terms available. There was no attendance pattern. There was no written warning anywhere in the file. There was no representative ever offered. There was a top decile performer with 3 signed positive reviews and a prepared termination document waiting for him before he ever sat down. Human Resources then interviews the 12 employees who spoke in that corridor the previous morning. Gregory Doyle goes first because he was actually inside the room. He arrives with a prepared explanation about maintaining standards and gets roughly 30 seconds into it before Evelyn asks him a single question, whether Marcus said the words $9 million out loud at that table. Doyle looks down at the table in front of him and says yes. Evelyn asks what he wrote down instead. Doyle says he wrote repeated availability issues, because that was the phrase Vanessa used, and he assumed she was holding information he did not have access to. Evelyn asks whether he verified any part of it at all. He says he did not. She asks whether Marcus asked him directly, in that room, whether it seemed reasonable, and Doyle says yes, and that he answered that everyone has to be held to the same standard. None of the 12 employees interviewed had checked a single fact before repeating it in that corridor. 4 of them admit they joined the conversation without even knowing what the meeting had actually been about. 2 say they simply assumed the department head must have had legitimate grounds. 1 woman says, without being asked, that she thought about walking over and asking Marcus directly, decided it was not her business, and has thought about that decision every single hour since. Vanessa's attorney arrives 4 minutes early and asks for water. Vanessa does not touch hers. Her hands stay flat on the table the entire meeting, pressed down as though the table itself might move if she let go, and twice she starts a sentence and does not finish it, catching herself mid-word and starting over in a lower voice. There is a folder in front of her that she never actually opens. Vanessa comes back in at 3 o'clock with an attorney and tries, one final time, to hold a position. She says her intent was always to protect the department. She says she believed the Halbrook terms were essentially complete and that implementation was purely administrative. She says that if she had known about Annex 4, she never would have proceeded the way she did. Evelyn tells her that Marcus raised the annex out loud in that very conference room before signing anything at all, and that she refused to hear it. She says the annex itself was transmitted to Vanessa on a Thursday, and the red receipt shows it was never opened. She says the failure was never one missed clause. The failure was 2.5 years of presenting another person's work as her own, followed by removing him the exact moment his visibility became a threat, using a document that was prepared before he even arrived at work that morning. Then she asks whether Vanessa understands that the exposure is no longer purely financial because Halbrook has confirmed his intention to approach Marcus directly. Vanessa has no answer for that question either. At 4:10, Evelyn drives to Marcus's house for the second time that day. She does not bring a term sheet, and she does not bring general counsel. She brings a printed copy of the review findings, 91 pages, and sets it on his kitchen table, telling him it belongs to him regardless of whatever he decides, because it is the record he told her did not exist. Marcus turns through it slowly. The correspondence log, the declined invitations, the transcript of the September review where his name never once appears, the metadata line reading 8:41 a.m. Evelyn tells him she is not going to ask him to come back because she already asked twice, and he answered clearly both times. She has come only to tell him what the company will do, whether he returns or not. Vanessa Whitmore will be terminated for abuse of authority and the sustained misappropriation of subordinate work. The employees who manufactured statements in that corridor will face documented consequences because a floor that convicts a colleague in 4 minutes is not a personnel problem, it is a culture, and the evaluation system that allowed a department head to file 3 top-decile reviews and then produce a resignation letter in the same breath will be rebuilt entirely so that client-facing work is attributed by permanent record instead of by summary. Marcus asks her why she is telling him any of this if she is not asking him for anything. Evelyn says because he told her that companies restructure while a contract is at risk and then quietly go back to how they were, and she wanted the findings physically in his hands so that if it happens again, he will be able to prove it happened. That is the thing that finally moves him, and it is not the money and it is not the title. He tells her he has 3 conditions. First, the apology has to happen in front of the entire 9th floor, not in a private letter, because the sentence was passed on him in public, and it will not be corrected in private. Second, the new attribution framework has to tie every client relationship permanently to the individual who actually built it, and it has to apply across every department in the company, not only his own. Third, nobody is to be disciplined simply for having applauded that day, because half of them clapped out of fear, and he has no interest in working for a company that punishes fear. The people who invented statements and repeated them as fact are a separate matter entirely, and he leaves that decision to her. Evelyn accepts all 3 conditions without hesitation. Marcus calls Derek Halbrook himself at 4:45, 45 minutes before the termination notice is scheduled to transmit. He does not make a case for Ashford Meridian. He tells Halbrook exactly what happened, including the parts that reflect badly on the firm that employs him. Then he says he intends to lead the program personally and that Halbrook will be dealing with him directly from now on, rather than with a summary written by somebody else. Halbrook tells him that is the only thing his board ever actually asked for. He withdraws the termination notice at 5 o'clock exactly. Marcus returns to the ninth floor the following Monday, 6 days after he left it, and the room he walks into is not the room he walked out of. Nobody is standing at the printer. Nobody is in the kitchen. 30 people stand together in the open center of the floor because Evelyn told them to be there at 9 o'clock sharp. The desk by the window has been left exactly as it was, cleared but untouched. On her written instruction, the Halbrook folder squared at the center where he had placed it after legal returned the physical copy. Evelyn does not use the conference room this time. She stands in the same open space where Vanessa once put both hands on the back of a chair, and she says that on the morning of October 15th, this company pressured a top-performing employee into signing a resignation letter that was written before he ever arrived at work, and that she did not know, and that not knowing was her own failure, not her defense. She says the review established that Marcus Coleman built the Halbrook relationship personally across 7 full months, that the executed agreement names him 11 separate times, and that the department claimed credit for his work in 3 consecutive executive reviews without ever once saying his name out loud. Then she turns to him directly and apologizes, and she does not qualify a single word of it. Marcus says very little in return. He tells the floor he did not come back for the contract, and he did not come back for the title, and that he turned both of them down twice already. He says he came back because the record now exists, and because that record is going to protect the next person the way it failed to protect him. The consequences move through the department that same week. Vanessa Whitmore is removed as head of strategic accounts and terminated for abuse of authority and the hostile misappropriation of a subordinate's work, with the findings entered permanently into her employment record. She does not appeal. Her attorney reads all 91 pages and advises her there is nothing left to contest. Gregory Doyle receives a formal written sanction and is removed from client-facing accounts for 12 months because he signed his name to a meeting record containing an allegation he never once attempted to verify. 3 employees who admitted inventing statements in that corridor received documented warnings of their own. Nobody is sanctioned simply for applauding. Vanessa's final conversation inside the building happens with a security escort standing 4 feet away, not because anyone believes she poses a physical risk, but because it is company policy for any termination involving a finding of misconduct, and Evelyn insists the policy apply evenly, without exception, to directors the same as to anyone else. Vanessa asks, at the elevator, whether Evelyn believes she meant to do this, whether any of it was ever really intentional in the way the report describes it. Evelyn tells her, gently but without any hesitation, that intent stopped being the relevant question the moment the pattern repeated itself for the 3rd consecutive year, and that a method does not require a villain, only someone unwilling to ask themselves an uncomfortable question at the right moment. The elevator doors close on that sentence, and it is the last thing anyone from Ashford Meridian ever says to her directly. The Halbrook program formally launches 11 days later. Marcus runs the first working session from the same corner conference room where he once signed his own resignation letter, which is not sentiment on his part. It is simply the room with the better display screen. Derek Halbrook flies in personally for the occasion, and on the first morning he shakes Marcus's hand in front of the entire assembled team and says his board committed $9,400,000 on the strength of one man who argued against his own company's lawyers at 4 in the morning, and that he wants everyone in that room to understand precisely what this company came within 1 single hour of throwing away forever. Marcus is appointed Director of Strategic Programs before the end of that month, with the Halbrook Agreement reporting directly to him. He accepts the title this time, and the reason he gives Evelyn has nothing to do with ambition. He says the person who was able to erase him held a title, and the only reliable protection against that ever happening again is to hold one himself. 6 months later, the new attribution framework is fully live across the entire company. Every client relationship now carries a permanent origination record naming the individual who actually opened it, and that record cannot be edited or overwritten by any department head. Executive reviews now require the underlying correspondence itself, not a manager's summary of it. Any resignation document generated by a manager is automatically flagged to Human Resources with its exact creation timestamp attached. A small technical safeguard that exists today because of one line of metadata reading 8:41 in the morning. 1 year later, the Halbrook program has expanded twice beyond its original scope, now worth just over $14 million across a renegotiated 5-year term, and Marcus has personally hired 6 new account specialists onto his team, 3 of them single parents he specifically sought out because he remembers exactly what it felt like to be passed over for a promotion track that assumed everyone's life could absorb constant travel. He has since put a down payment on a house in Ridgemont Park, the same neighborhood he was renting in, with a small yard where Xavier now keeps a garden bed of tomatoes that mostly fail to grow, and Amara has started telling people at school that her father runs a 9-figure account for a company most of them have never heard of, which is not quite accurate, but he has stopped correcting her because for the first time in 3 years, being seen feels like something he can actually let his children witness. Marcus also uses part of his new compensation to fund 4 scholarships a year at the community college near Ridgemont Park, reserved specifically for single parents returning to finish a degree they had to pause, a program he named quietly after Denise without ever making an announcement about it, because he has never needed credit to know a thing mattered. 11 students have gone through it in 2 years. 3 have already graduated. He keeps their photographs, printed and taped inside a folder he keeps at his desk, the same desk by the window, because he asked to keep that desk even after his promotion, and Evelyn, without needing to be told why, arranged it exactly the way he wanted. Vanessa Whitmore, meanwhile, has not found comparable work in the 18 months since her termination. 2 firms that called Ashford Meridian for a reference received the same answer both times: a factual, documented account of abuse of authority and sustained misappropriation of subordinate credit. Language that cannot be softened into something more forgiving because it is simply what happened, and it is simply what the 91 pages prove. She left the building on a Thursday with a single box, and the floor she once celebrated on watched her go the exact same way it had watched Marcus go 6 days earlier. She understood the symmetry perfectly because she had designed the original scene herself. Gregory Doyle completed his 12-month restriction from client-facing accounts and returned to the floor a visibly quieter man, one who now double-checks every claim before repeating it in a meeting, a habit he says he wishes he had built 3 years earlier before it cost someone else so much to teach him. The desk by the window eventually went to a junior analyst who had asked about it on his very first afternoon at the company, and who, when handed it, said nothing at all about the view, only that he had heard the man who used to sit there never once raised his voice, not even when he had every reason to. 2 years after the morning he stood in that corridor holding a paper cup of water, Marcus Coleman is no longer simply the director of strategic programs. He now oversees a full division of 11 account leads, and under the attribution framework he insisted on, every one of them has their name permanently attached to the relationships they personally build, a policy that has since been credited internally with cutting voluntary turnover in the commercial division by nearly 40%, because people no longer feel the need to leave quietly in order to be seen elsewhere. He started a small internal mentorship program called the Substrate Initiative, named half as a joke and half as a reminder after the word Evelyn used in that first review to describe where his work had always lived, underneath the summary, unseen. The program has since paired 19 employees, most of them single parents or first-generation professionals, with senior leaders who commit in writing to reviewing their actual work product, not just their manager's account of it. 4 of those 19 have since been promoted directly out of the program. The Halbrook account itself, once a single $9,400,000 agreement hanging by the thread of one clause, has grown into the largest single relationship in Ashford Meridian's history, now spanning 3 separate business units and worth more than the company's entire logistics division did the year Marcus was hired. Derek Halbrook still calls him directly, not a department line, not a shared inbox, his personal cell phone, because after 19 years of being disappointed by suppliers who disappeared the moment the ink dried, he has finally found the one who did not. Amara Coleman is 11 now, and she has started keeping her own ledger, a spiral notebook she calls her Fairness Journal, where she writes down, in her own handwriting, Moments at school when she notices someone getting credit for something they didn't do, or someone being blamed for something they didn't cause. Marcus has never told her to do this. He found the notebook by accident one evening while helping her look for a missing shoe, and he sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before deciding not to say anything about it at all, because some lessons are better left to plant themselves. In any workplace, talent can be hidden by envy for a time, but it cannot be denied forever. A good leader is not the one who quietly removes the people who are better at the job than they are. A good leader is the one who knows exactly how to recognize them, credit them, and protect them, especially when nobody else in the room is willing to ask a single question before passing judgment. Marcus never talks about the money when people ask him about that October, and people do ask, more often than he would like. He tells them instead about the 4 minutes in the corridor, because that is the part that actually changed him, not the contract, not the title, not the 91 pages. He says most people believe fairness is something that happens automatically, that good work simply gets seen over time, the way water eventually finds its own level. He says he believed that too, for 3 years, right up until the moment he understood that water does not find its own level in a room where nobody is willing to look down. He tells his children something simpler, something he repeats often enough that Amara can now finish the sentence for him. He tells them that being underestimated is not the same thing as being small, and that the two things only start to look the same when you stop insisting on the difference. He tells them the world will not always ask before it decides who you are, and that the only real defense anyone has against that is to keep doing the work so honestly and so consistently that eventually the record speaks, even when you do not. What would you have done, standing in that corridor for 4 minutes, watching 30 people you worked beside for years decide who you were without ever asking you a thing? How far would you go to protect the 2 children waiting for you at home, even after everyone around you had already made up their minds? What injustice have you personally watched happen, quietly, at a desk near you, and said nothing about, because it was easier not to look too closely? If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who still believes that quiet, steady effort is worth something, even when nobody is clapping for it. And leave a comment telling us which moment in Marcus Coleman's story stayed with you the longest, because somewhere out there, somebody is standing in a corridor right now, waiting for just one person to finally ask them a question.